It was the day Bella and Max had been dreaming about for months, the day they would finally unite as one. The sun was shining brightly over the lush green garden, casting a warm glow over the decorated venue. The air smelled of fresh flowers, and soft music floated through the breeze, creating the perfect atmosphere for a wedding. Every little detail had been carefully planned, and today, everything had to be perfect. The guests were gathered, all seated in rows of soft, white chairs, eagerly waiting for the ceremony to begin. A sense of excitement hung in the air. The cat couple had become the talk of the town. Everyone knew how much they loved each other and how hard they had worked to make this day a reality. It was a day for the books, and no one wanted to miss it. Bella, the beautiful bride, stood behind the curtain, her heart racing in her chest. She looked at herself in the mirror, adjusting the delicate lace of her wedding gown. Her fur, perfectly brushed, gleamed in the sunlight, and her big bright eyes sparkled with joy. But beneath that joy, there was a hint of nervousness. The idea of being the center of attention, of all eyes being on her, made her paws feel a little shaky. Her best friend, Rosie, noticed the slight tremor in her paws and gently placed a paw on her shoulder. "You look amazing, Bella. Max is going to be so proud to have you by his side," Rosie said, giving her a comforting smile. Bella smiled back, though it didn't fully reach her eyes. She had dreamed of this moment her whole life, and now that it was here, it felt surreal. Would everything go according to plan? Would the day be as perfect as she had imagined? Outside, Max stood at the altar, looking dashing in his tuxedo. His fur was combed neatly, and his eyes shone with excitement. He stood tall, a look of nervous anticipation on his face as he glanced around the garden. The flowers, the decorations, the guests, everything was set. But there was one thing he couldn't control, the overwhelming feeling of love and nervousness that flooded his heart. He tried to steady his breath. "She's going to be here soon," he whispered to himself. "This is it, our big day." He thought back to the journey that had led to this moment. They had been through so much together, from the challenges of growing up in a small neighborhood to building their little family. Max couldn't imagine his life without Bella by his side. She was everything to him. He just wanted this day to be as special as their love for each other. Behind the scenes, the wedding planner, a stylish Persian cat named Camille, was making sure everything was in place. She was running around, checking the flower arrangements, making sure the food was ready, and ensuring that the guests were all in their seats. She had worked tirelessly for weeks to make this day perfect. Her job was to make sure no detail was overlooked, and she did it with the utmost professionalism. The guests were all talking among themselves, excited for the ceremony to start. They all knew Bella and Max had been planning this wedding for a long time. They'd been living together for a few years now, and it was clear to everyone that their love for each other was undeniable. The two cats were the epitome of what a perfect couple looked like, and now, everyone was gathered to witness their love take the next step. As the music began to play, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin, Bella felt a rush of emotion sweep over her. "This is real," she thought to herself. "This is really happening." Rosie held Bella's paw tightly as they walked toward the entrance of the garden. Bella felt the nerves building again, but she took a deep breath, determined not to let her fears get the best of her. She had to stay calm. "I'm doing this for Max, for us," she reminded herself. Outside, the guests stood up, their eyes fixed on the entrance. Max's heart skipped a beat as he saw Bella step into the garden. Time seemed to slow down as she walked down the aisle, her eyes locked with his. She looked radiant, and his chest swelled with pride. Bella was perfect. She was the cat of his dreams. As she walked closer to the altar, Max's paws began to sweat, and his mind raced. He tried to remind himself that this was just the beginning. They still had a lifetime ahead of them, but in that moment, all he could focus on was how amazing she looked and how lucky he was to be standing there, waiting to marry her. "I do," Bella whispered under her breath as she reached the altar, her eyes shimmering with unused tears. Max reached out and took her paw gently. "I do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And just as they were about to exchange their vows, something unexpected happened. A loud rumble echoed in the sky, and the wind picked up, making the trees sway ominously. The guests exchanged confused glances, and Bella and Max froze. Was it just a gust of wind, or was something more sinister approaching? The beautiful day that was supposed to mark the beginning of their forever suddenly felt like it was slipping out of their control. Max looked around, trying to calm his racing heart. The ceremony continued, but the unease in the air was undeniable. Something was not quite right. The distant rumbling grew louder, and the sky seemed to darken, as if the clouds were gathering for a storm. The day was not as perfect as they had imagined. The storm, in the distance, had already begun. The wedding ceremony was in full swing, but the unease in the air had grown more palpable with every passing second. Max and Bella stood at the altar, paws intertwined, their love shining through their eyes. The guests were watching them, captivated by the beautiful couple who had finally found each other. For a moment, everything felt perfect again. But then the rumble returned, this time louder and closer. It wasn't just the wind, Bella thought. There was something wrong. She glanced at the sky, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the clouds beginning to darken, swirling in strange, unpredictable patterns. The temperature seemed to drop slightly, sending a chill down her spine. Max squeezed her paw, sensing the change in her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice a little shaky. Bella nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine," she said, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bad. She looked out over the crowd, noticing that the guests were growing quieter, their attention diverted away from the ceremony. The distant rumbling grew louder, and now it wasn't just the wind. There was something else, something beneath the earth. It felt like a deep, threatening growl coming from far below the ground. Max's heart began to race as the air around them thickened, and the once beautiful garden seemed to lose its vibrancy, replaced by a strange, unsettling stillness. And then it happened. The ground beneath them shook violently. At first, it was a small tremor, like a passing truck, but then the shaking intensified. The ground trembled, sending ripples through the grass. Chairs rattled, and some of the guests stumbled as they tried to regain their balance. A gasp spread through the crowd, and several of the guests began to murmur in confusion and concern. Max's eyes widened as he looked around, his heart thudding in his chest. "What was that?" he asked, his voice filled with fear. He tried to stay calm, but the growing tension in the air made it harder to breathe. Bella's fur stood on end as she felt the earth shake beneath her. "Something's wrong, Max. We need to get out of here," she said urgently, pulling on his paw. Before he could respond, the tremor stopped, but the unease in the air didn't. The wind had picked up again, this time blowing fiercely, making the trees sway violently. The decorations on the tables fluttered, and the wedding arch began to creak under the strain of the wind. The noise of the wind was deafening, making it almost impossible to hear anything else. Max turned his gaze to the sky, his heart sinking. The clouds were swirling in a dizzying, unnatural pattern, and a strange, distant sound seemed to echo through the air, like the roar of the sea, but somehow more menacing. The storm was building, and it was unlike anything he had ever seen. "Max," Bella whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening? What is that sound?" Max didn't know how to answer. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, but he didn't want to show it. He needed to stay calm, for her, for the guests, for everything. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary storm. Something far worse was brewing, and it wasn't just the weather. Suddenly, the sky darkened, and a flash of lightning cracked through the clouds, striking the ground in the distance with a blinding white light. The guests screamed, and several of them began to rush toward the exits. trying to escape. The beautiful wedding was quickly turning into a nightmare. Max grabbed Bella by the paw, his grip tight with fear. "We have to go now," he said, pulling her toward the exit. But as they moved, the ground shook again, this time more violently than before. The flowers around them began to wilt, and the garden seemed to come alive in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. Bella's heart raced as she stumbled, trying to keep up with Max. "Max, what's going on? Is it an earthquake?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Max shook his head, his mind racing. He couldn't explain what was happening, but he knew they had to leave. The storm, the rumbling, the sudden shift in the atmosphere. It all felt like a warning, a sign that something far worse was about to strike. But what? Before he could answer, a deafening roar filled the air, a sound so loud it made the ground beneath them tremble. It wasn't thunder. It was something else, something far more terrifying. Max froze, his breath caught in his throat. And then, from the distance, the first wave of destruction arrived. The storm had arrived, but it wasn't like any storm anyone had seen before. The wind howled, tearing through the trees like an angry beast. The sky, once a peaceful blue, had darkened to an ominous gray, and strange, swirling clouds twisted above the wedding venue, as if nature itself were at war. Max and Bella could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy like a storm cloud ready to burst. The guests were now fully aware that something was terribly wrong. Panic began to spread through the crowd like wildfire. Whispers filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. "What is happening?" one guest asked, her eyes wide with fear. "This isn't just a storm," another murmured, trying to stay calm. But the tremors beneath their paws were hard to ignore. Bella's heart was racing. She could feel the fear creeping up her spine, but she didn't want to show it. She needed to stay strong for Max for their special day. She clutched his paw tighter, her mind spinning with questions. "Max, we need to leave now," Bella said, her voice trembling. Max nodded, his own fear mirrored in his wide, frightened eyes. "I know. We have to get out of here before it's too late." But the fear in his voice was undeniable. He had always been the one to protect Bella, to be her rock. But in this moment, the tables had turned. He felt helpless. There was no way he could stop what was happening, no way he could fix it. The ground shook again, harder this time, as if the earth itself was protesting. Bella gasped and stumbled, but Max caught her just in time. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I think so," Bella replied, but her fur was standing on end. Her instincts were screaming at her to run, to get as far away from the venue as possible. But there was nowhere to go. The storm was everywhere. Then, without warning, there was a loud, ear-splitting crack, and the earth beneath them trembled violently. The wedding arch, once beautiful and delicate, began to sway and creak ominously. One of the tall trees in the garden was struck by a gust of wind, its heavy branches snapping with a sickening crack. A gasp from the crowd echoed through the air, followed by screams as the guests began to flee in panic. Max grabbed Bella's paw, pulling her toward the exit, but they were both moving in slow motion, the world around them spinning into chaos. People were scrambling, pushing each other, desperate to get away from the crumbling venue. Some of the guests were tripping over fallen chairs, while others were too paralyzed by fear to move. It was like the entire world was coming undone. And then it happened. A deafening roar split the air, a sound so loud it made the earth tremble beneath their paws. It was like the roar of an animal, but it was too deep, too unnatural. Bella and Max froze, their fur standing on end as they looked around, searching for the source of the terrifying sound. Max's heart was pounding in his chest, and for a moment he felt completely disoriented. What was that sound? What was causing it? The roar came again, louder this time, and this time it was followed by a series of smaller crashing sounds, like something large was moving in the distance. Bella's eyes widened as she tried to make sense of the chaos unfolding around them. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the noise. "What's happening? What's going on?" Max looked around frantically, but he had no answers. The ground shook beneath them again, and a cloud of dust and debris filled the air. Through the haze, Max could see the guests scattering in all directions, but it didn't matter. No one knew where to go. No one knew what was happening. And then the wind shifted. Bella and Max turned their heads toward the horizon, their eyes widening as they saw what was coming. A massive wave was rising in the distance, towering higher and higher, its frothy crest gleaming in the dim light. It was like a wall of water, moving faster than anything they had ever seen. The roar of the wave grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. Bella's breath caught in her throat. "Max," she whispered, her voice filled with terror. "It's coming. The tsunami." Max looked at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. How could this be happening? A tsunami? At their wedding? The thought seemed impossible, but the wave was undeniable. It was heading straight for them. "Run, Bella," Max shouted, his voice filled with panic. But it was too late. The wave was too close, too fast. There was no time to escape. The ground shook again, and the wind howled with even more force, knocking trees over and sending debris flying. Max and Bella grabbed each other, their hearts pounding as the tsunami surged toward them, ready to destroy everything in its path. In that moment, everything they had planned, everything they had dreamed of, seemed to vanish. The perfect wedding day was slipping away, and all they could do was hold on to each other as the wave drew closer. The sound of the approaching wave was deafening. The air around them crackled with energy, and the wind had transformed into a savage roar, lashing out like a wild beast. Max and Bella stood frozen for a moment, unable to fully comprehend the danger that was rushing toward them. It felt like time had stopped. Everything was moving in slow motion, and the wave, now towering above them, seemed almost unreal. Bella's breath hitched in her chest, her heart pounding as she stared at the wall of water that was now rapidly closing in on them. It was impossible to escape. The ocean, once calm and peaceful, had turned into something monstrous, something beyond their control. Max, still gripping Bella's paw, could feel his pulse racing. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, to find shelter, but there was nowhere to go. The tsunami was too close, and its force was overwhelming. It felt as though the world around them was crumbling, the ground beneath them trembling with the weight of the incoming disaster. "Max, what are we going to do?" Bella's voice was filled with panic, but she was trying to stay calm. She needed to be strong for Max, just like she always had been, but nothing could have prepared them for something like this. Max's mind raced, but he couldn't think straight. The tsunami was crashing toward them, its white frothy waves rising higher with every second. He could feel the ground beneath his paws begin to tremble, and the trees around them swayed dangerously, as if they too were trying to escape the coming devastation. He looked desperately around, trying to spot a way out, but the path was blocked. The water was coming too fast, too powerfully. "Bella," Max said, his voice hoarse, "we need to find higher ground. Now." But there was no time. The first wave hit with a deafening crash, sending a spray of water and debris into the air. The sound was like thunder, like the earth itself had cracked open. Bella and Max were knocked off their paws as the shockwave of the wave hit them. The water surged forward, swallowing everything in its path. Max gripped Bella tightly as they were carried by the force of the wave. The water was cold and violent, swirling around them like a wild force of nature. The wind screamed in their ears, and the world around them became a blur of chaos. Flashes of trees, flowers, and buildings all disappearing beneath the water. Bella's heart pounded in her chest, and she gasped for breath. But the water was overwhelming. She couldn't breathe, couldn't see. She felt like she was drowning, her body tossed and turned by the unforgiving tide. Max's grip on her remained firm. though his own panic was rising. He fought to keep them above the water, trying to keep his head above the crashing waves. "Hold on, Bella. Just hold on," he shouted, his voice barely audible above the roar of the tsunami. Bella's eyes were wide with fear as the wave carried them further and further from the safety of the wedding venue. The world around them was unrecognizable. She couldn't see the ground anymore, couldn't feel the solid earth beneath her paws. It was as if everything they had known, the beautiful garden, the guests, the love they had shared, was being swallowed by the ocean. Max held her close, his paws wrapped tightly around her as they were pulled deeper into the sea. But no matter how hard he fought against the water, the tsunami's power was far greater than anything he could handle. Through the crashing waves, Max could see that the guests were in complete disarray. Some were being carried away by the water, while others scrambled to stay on their feet. It was chaos, utter chaos. There was no time to save everyone. The force of the waves seemed to go on forever, the floodwaters rising higher and higher, sweeping through the once beautiful garden. Max felt like he was being pulled into a nightmare. It wasn't just the physical force of the water that scared him. It was the sheer helplessness of it all. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't protect Bella. And in that moment, all of their hopes for a perfect wedding day seemed to shatter like glass. Bella's voice broke through the chaos. "Max," she cried, her tone desperate. "What's happening? Where are we going?" Max looked around, disoriented, his mind racing. He had no answers. All he could do was hold on to her and try to keep her safe. The water was pulling them further away from everything they knew, further away from the life they had dreamed of building together. In the distance, Max saw the outline of a building, a large, sturdy structure that might offer them some shelter from the raging waters. His heart skipped a beat. If they could just reach it, they might be able to survive this. "Bella, look, over there," Max shouted, pointing toward the building. He could barely hear his own voice over the roar of the waves, but he hoped she understood. He pulled her toward it with all his strength, his body battered by the relentless water. Every step felt like a battle, but Max wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when Bella's life was at stake. The waves kept crashing against them, but Max didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not until they were safe. The world was a blur. Max could barely see through the crashing waves and the white foam surrounding them. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, each breath feeling more impossible than the last. The water was relentless, pulling them under, pushing them toward the unknown. But through it all, Max held on to Bella. No matter what, he wouldn't let her go. They were still being carried by the wave. But now, they were closer to the building Max had spotted earlier. His heart raced with both fear and hope. If they could just get there, they might have a chance. The idea of shelter, of safety, kept him going, kept him fighting against the ocean's fury. Bella's fur was soaked, her body shaking, but she was still there, clinging to Max for dear life. The terror in her eyes mirrored his own, but there was something else there too, a fierce determination. She refused to give up. For Max, for their future. "Max." Bella's voice barely rose above the roar of the tsunami, but he heard her loud and clear. I can't hold on much longer." Max's heart clenched as he felt her slipping, the water pulling her farther away. She was struggling, too weak to fight the current as fiercely as she had before. His grip tightened on her paw, his muscles straining as he fought to keep them both afloat. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. Not when they had so much left to live for. "I'm right here, Bella," Max shouted, his voice raw with panic. "Just a little longer. We're almost there." But the distance to the building felt like miles. With every crashing wave, they were pushed farther from it. The storm's power was relentless, as if the ocean itself was determined to swallow them whole. Max had never felt so small, so helpless in his life. Another wave hit, and this time, the force of the water tore them apart. Max's grip on Bella slipped, and before he could react, she was pulled away, disappearing beneath the surface. "No!" Max screamed, his voice filled with terror. He reached out desperately, his paw grazing the edge of her tail before the water yanked her completely out of his reach. His heart stopped as he was dragged under the water, his body tumbling and spinning in the violent sea. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe. The pressure of the water was crushing, and for a moment, he thought he might drown. But then, he saw a flash of something. Was it Bella? Was it her? Max's mind raced as he kicked against the water, his eyes scanning frantically. He had to find her. He had to save her. And then, through the crashing waves, he saw her, a small, trembling figure, barely staying afloat, clinging to a piece of debris. Bella. Max didn't think twice. He pushed through the water with every ounce of strength he had left, his body aching from the effort, his breath shallow and fast. He reached her just in time, his paws grabbing onto her as the current threatened to pull her away again. "Bella." Max gasped, relief flooding through him as he held her close. She was coughing, sputtering water, but she was alive. She was safe. Max held her tightly, trying to keep them both above the water. The debris around them bobbed in the water, but the force of the current made it impossible to stay still. They had to keep moving. They couldn't let themselves be trapped in the waves. "Can you swim?" Max asked urgently, his voice shaking. Bella nodded weakly, her eyes filled with exhaustion and fear. "I'll try," she whispered. "Just don't let go." Max nodded, tightening his grip on her paw. Together, they kicked toward the distant building, the one that had once seemed so far away, but now felt like the only hope they had. With every stroke, Max felt a little more certain. They could make it. They could survive. But the storm had other plans. As they swam, another wave crashed over them, larger and more powerful than before. It knocked them off course, separating them again. "No!" Max shouted, panic rising in his chest. He fought against the wave, reaching out for Bella, but the force of the water pulled them apart once again. He was being carried further and further away from her, the ocean closing in around him. Despair began to settle in, and for the first time, Max wasn't sure if they would make it. The tsunami was too powerful, the world too chaotic. But then, through the murky water, Max saw something. A flash of movement. Bella. She was there, struggling against the waves, but she was alive. Max pushed himself harder, his heart pounding in his chest as he fought to get back to her. He couldn't lose her. Not now. This time, when they finally reunited, they didn't let go. They clung to each other with everything they had, relying on one another to stay afloat. The water was still wild, but Max wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. And then finally, after what felt like an eternity, they'd reached the building. The tsunami had torn through the land, but they had made it. They had survived. They collapsed onto the building's sturdy walls, panting and shivering from exhaustion. They were safe, for now. Max looked at Bella, his eyes filled with relief and gratitude. They had survived the storm. But they both knew that their struggle wasn't over. The world around them was in ruins, and their future was uncertain. But one thing was clear. As long as they had each other, they would face whatever came next together. The waves finally began to subside, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Max and Bella sat on the edge of the ruined building, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, their fur matted and drenched from the violent ocean. The once beautiful wedding venue, the place where they had hoped to start their life together, was now nothing more than a distant memory, swallowed by the ocean's wrath. Max's heart ached as he looked around. The devastation was beyond anything he could have imagined. The gardens, once alive with flowers, were now underwater, and the trees that had once framed the event were now mere silhouettes in the distance. The world they knew had changed in an instant. He glanced at Bella, her body pressed against his as they tried to find warmth in each other's presence. Her eyes were closed, but Max could see the pain and fear still lingering in her expression. She was trying to stay strong, but even the bravest of hearts could be shattered by the chaos they had just lived through. "Bella," Max whispered softly, his voice hoarse from the salt water. "Are you okay?" Bella opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his with a faint but strained smile. "I will be," she said quietly, though her words didn't hold the same certainty that they once had. She looked out at the wreckage around them, the silence that followed the storm so much louder than the roaring waves. "But everything we've known, it's all gone." Max looked at the wreckage, his heart sinking. He had no words. What could he say? The storm had taken everything, except for them. They were alive. That was the only thing that mattered now. "It's not over," Max said, his voice steady now, though it trembled slightly. "We're still here. We'll rebuild." Bella nodded, her eyes still filled with that mix of sorrow and hope. "Together," she added softly, squeezing his paw. "We'll rebuild. I know we can." Max couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion. Through all the chaos, through all the terror they had faced, they were still here. They still had each other. It was more than enough. They could face the aftermath together, whatever it took. But even as they clung to each other, the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. They weren't the only ones who had been affected by the tsunami. Max looked around at the debris scattered across the land, the remains of their wedding guests, the gifts, the food. It was a scene of complete destruction. But amidst the wreckage, he could see figures moving. They weren't alone. Max stood up, still shaky from the ordeal, and scanned the horizon. It seemed like the storm had passed, but the damage was far from over. There were others who had been caught in the waves, others who had struggled just like they had. Some had made it to safety, others hadn't. "Bella, we need to help them," Max said urgently, his heart racing. He had no idea how he could help, but he couldn't just sit by while others were in danger. Bella stood with him, determination in her eyes. "We have to. We can't let them suffer too." They began to move, navigating the rubble of what was once their wedding venue. Every step felt heavy, the weight of the destruction around them pressing down on their spirits. They saw other cats who had managed to survive the waves, some of them injured, others too shaken to move. Max and Bella didn't hesitate. They rushed to their side, offering help in whatever way they could. Max used his strength to help lift debris, while Bella offered comforting words to those who were too traumatized to speak. They worked together, side by side, helping those in need. The bond between them was stronger than ever, and through their shared efforts, they began to rebuild, not just their future, but their sense of hope. As the day wore on, the sun began to set. The storm had passed, but the work ahead of them was just beginning. They weren't sure what the future held, what their lives would look like after such a tragedy. But they knew one thing for certain. They were no longer just a couple. They were a team. A team that would face whatever came next, together. Max looked at Bella, his heart full of gratitude for the strength she had shown through the storm. Despite everything they had been through, despite the overwhelming odds they now faced, they had each other. And for the first time in a long while, Max allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild everything that had been lost. "Thank you," he whispered to Bella, his voice thick with emotion. "For being with me. For staying." Bella smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "Always, Max. Always." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, they knew that while the storm had taken so much from them, it had also given them something invaluable. A chance to rebuild. Together. The days after the tsunami felt like a blur. The world had changed, and Max and Bella were left to pick up the pieces. They had lost so much. Family, friends, their beautiful wedding venue. But they hadn't lost each other. That was the one constant that had kept them moving forward, no matter how impossible it seemed. The aftermath of the disaster had brought them closer, and their determination to rebuild only grew stronger. They had managed to gather the survivors, the ones who had made it through the storm with them. Max and Bella worked tirelessly, not just to fix the physical damage, but to restore hope to their community. They had lost so much, but they weren't going to let the storm take their spirits too. The days were long, filled with work, but there were moments of peace too. Small victories. When they fixed a broken wall or managed to help a friend find shelter, it felt like a win. They had made it through the worst of the storm, and now they were picking up the pieces, one by one. It wasn't easy. The road to recovery was slow, and sometimes it felt like they weren't making any progress at all. But every time Max looked at Bella, he saw the same fire in her eyes, the same resilience that had kept her fighting through the darkest moments. They were rebuilding not just their lives, but their future. One evening, after another long day of work, Max and Bella sat on the edge of the now-repaired building. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the ruins that were slowly becoming home again. It was peaceful, almost serene, in contrast to the chaos they had endured just days before. Bella leaned her head on Max's shoulder, and for a moment, they just sat in silence, taking in the quiet. There was a sense of calm now, a feeling of hope that hadn't been there before. They had survived the storm. They had survived together. Max looked down at Bella, his heart full of gratitude. "I don't know how we did it," he said quietly, his voice filled with awe. Bella smiled softly, her eyes sparkling with determination. "We did it because we had each other," she replied, her voice steady. "We're a team, Max. We've always been a team." Max smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. It was true. They had always been a team, and no matter what the future held, he knew they would face it together. No storm, no disaster could tear them apart. As they sat there, the last rays of the sun fading into the horizon, they both felt a sense of peace settle over them. The world had changed, yes, but they were still here. They had made it through the worst of it, and now they were rebuilding, not just the physical world around them, but their lives, together. They had lost so much, but in each other, they had found something even more precious. A new beginning, a chance to start over, to rebuild their love, their community, and their future. It wasn't going to be easy, and the challenges ahead would surely test them. But Max and Bella knew one thing for certain. They were ready. They were ready to face whatever came next, together. And as they watched the sun set on the horizon, they knew that this was just the beginning. Their journey wasn't over. It had only just begun.